The ghost of Jacob Thorne rattled around the skeleton of his family's farm. He had come home to die, but the process was taking too long. Each sunrise was an insult, a pale, watery light spilling over the skeletal fingers of dead apple trees and illuminating another day he had to endure. The farmhouse itself was a study in decay, its white paint peeling back like sunburnt skin to reveal the graying wood beneath. Windows were broken, boarded over with mismatched scraps of plywood that looked like crude bandages on an open wound. The wind, a constant, mournful presence in this hollow, whistled through the gaps, singing a lullaby of rot and ruin. Jake moved through the derelict rooms like a specter in his own life. The floorboards groaned under his weight, a chorus of complaints from a house that had given up. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light, the only lively things in the suffocating stillness. He ran a hand over his face, the rough texture of his beard a familiar abrasion. His other hand, the one that still worked properly, rested on the cold steel of the pistol he always carried tucked into the back of his jeans. It was a comforting weight, a final option. His body was a roadmap of his failure. A latticework of scars crisscrossed his back and left arm, souvenirs from the IED that had ended his world in Ramadi. The shrapnel had torn through flesh and bone, shredding his career as a Marine raider and vaporizing the men he had called brothers. His left leg was a dead thing below the knee, a marvel of titanium and polymer that ached with a phantom cold. But the deepest wounds were the ones no one could see, the ones that festered behind his eyes. He saw them every time he closed his eyes. Garcia, laughing, his teeth a brilliant white against his sun-darkened skin, just before the world turned to fire and sound. Miller, the quiet one, giving him a thumbs up from across the alley. Lieutenant Davies pointing at a map drawn in the dirt. Ghosts. They were his constant companions, their silent accusations echoing in the shell of his skull. Survivor's guilt was a clinical, sterile term for the cancer eating him from the inside out. It wasn't guilt. It was a debt, and he had no way to repay it. So he existed here, in this graveyard of his past, surrounded by the ghosts of his family and the ghosts of his war. He drank cheap whiskey until the edges of the world blurred and the voices faded to a dull murmur. He cleaned his weapons with a methodical precision that was the only piece of his old self he had left. He waited. For what? He wasn't sure. An ending. An excuse. The biting November wind was his only conversation. It carried the smell of wet earth and dying leaves, the scent of inevitable decay. He stood on the sagging porch, the cold seeping through his worn boots, and stared out at the gray, unforgiving sky. The world was leached of color, matching the landscape of his soul. He was hollowed out, a vessel filled only with echoes and rage. He took a long pull from a flask, the burn of the whiskey a familiar punishment. It did little to warm the ice in his core. He was a broken warrior in a broken place, waiting for the last piece of him to finally crumble into dust. It was in this profound silence, this self-imposed purgatory, that he first heard it. A sound. It was thin, almost lost in the keening of the wind. A high-pitched, desperate cry that snagged on the edge of his awareness. He froze, head cocked, listening. He was trained to dissect sounds, to identify the snap of a twig from 100 yards, the metallic click of a safety being disengaged. This was different. This wasn't a threat. It was pain. He tried to ignore it. It was not his problem. Nothing was his problem anymore. His duty to protect had died in a storm of fire and ball bearings on a dusty street half a world away. He had failed the men who counted on him. He would not, could not, be responsible for anything ever again. He turned to go back inside, back to the bottle and the blessed numbness it offered. The sound came again, sharper this time. A whimper that cracked in the middle, a pure, distilled note of misery that cut through his apathy like a shard of glass. It came from the direction of his neighbor's property, a squalid patch of land owned by a man named Earl, whose existence was as blighted as the rusted-out cars and junk piles that littered his yard. Against his better judgment, against every instinct screaming at him to retreat into his shell, Jake found himself moving. His bad leg protested, each step a dull thud and a grinding of mechanics. But he pushed on. He moved through the tangled briars and weeds that separated the two properties, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. He moved with a ghost of his old stealth, a predator's grace that his broken body still remembered. As he drew closer, the smell hit him. The sharp, acrid stench of filth and infection, a smell he knew from the battlefield. It was the smell of something left to die. He crested a small, muddy rise and saw it. Chained in a pen of mud in its own waste was a German shepherd. The dog was a ghost, too. Its proud form was reduced to a collection of sharp angles, its fur matted and caked with mud. Its ribs stood out in stark relief, a xylophone of starvation. A heavy rusted chain was cinched tight around its neck, connected to a stake driven deep into the stinking ground. The dog was lying on its side, its breathing shallow. It lifted its head weakly as Jake approached, and for a second, a low growl rumbled in its chest. It was a pathetic sound, devoid of any real threat. It was the last ember of defiance in a creature that had been systematically destroyed. Jake stopped. He didn't look at the matted fur or the protruding bones. He looked into the dog's eyes. They were a pale, intelligent brown, and in their depths, he saw it. He saw the same haunted, hollowed-out look that stared back at him from his own mirror every morning. He saw the betrayal, the pain, the utter exhaustion of a soul that had been pushed past its breaking point. It was a reflection, a mirror. In that moment, something deep inside him, a tectonic plate of emotion he thought long dead, shifted. "Hey," a voice slurred, thick with malice. "The hell you doing on my property?" Jake turned slowly. Earl stood there, a caricature of rural decay. His belly strained against a greasy t-shirt, his face was a pasty, unshaven mask, and his small eyes were mean. He held a half-empty beer bottle like a club. "Your dog," Jake said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, rusty from disuse. Earl smirked, a foul, yellow-toothed expression. "What about him? He ain't hurtin' nobody." He took a swig of beer, then spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near the dog's head. The animal flinched, but didn't have the energy to move away. "He's dying," Jake stated. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. "He's tough, he'll pull through, or he won't." Earl shrugged, the gesture a profound dismissal of the life chained a few feet away. "Not your concern." The cold rage that had been Jake's constant companion for years began to coalesce. It focused from a dull, ambient hum into a sharp, cold point, aimed directly at the man in front of him. "I'll buy him," Jake said, his voice flat. Earl laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "He ain't for sale. Good guard dog. Scares people off. He can't even stand up." "He barks," Earl sneered. To prove his point, he drew back his foot and kicked the dog hard in its bony flank. The animal let out a sharp yelp of pain, a sound that sent a jolt of pure, white-hot fury through Jake's body. Everything went quiet. The wind died down. The world narrowed to the space between Jake and Earl. Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply let the mask of the civilian slip away. The thing that looked out of his eyes was not the broken man from the farm. It was the raider. It was the cold, efficient killer who had hunted men in the dark. "Name a price," Jake said, and the words were not a request. They were an order, delivered with the chilling finality of a rifle bolt sliding home. Earl's smirk faltered. He saw the shift in Jake's posture, the unnerving stillness, the absolute absence of fear or hesitation in his eyes. He saw a predator preparing an ambush. The bully in him, reliant on the fear of others, suddenly found itself face to face with something it didn't understand, something ancient and lethal. I said he ain't for sale," Earl stammered, but his conviction had evaporated. Jake took one slow step forward. His limp was barely noticeable. "I am not asking again. You will sell me the dog, and you will do it now." Fear, stark and primal, flickered in Earl's eyes. He looked from Jake to the pathetic creature in the mud and back again. He was a coward, and Jake's quiet, deadly certainty terrified him more than any shouted threat ever could. 500, Earl blurted out, the number plucked from the air. It was an absurd price for a dying dog. Jake didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and counted out the bills. It was most of the cash he had left in the world. He held it out. Get the key for the chain. Earl snatched the money, his greed momentarily overpowering his fear. He fumbled with a ring of keys, his hands shaking. He unlocked the thick padlock on the dog's collar, the metal groaning in protest. The chain fell away into the mud. Earl didn't linger. He scurried back toward his hovel without a backward glance, clutching the cash like a prize. Jake was alone with the dog. He knelt slowly, his bad knee protesting. Hey, he whispered, his voice softer now. It's okay, I got you. The dog watched him, its body trembling. It was too weak to run, too traumatized to trust. Jake didn't try to touch it. He simply sat there in the cold mud, a few feet away, and waited. He was fluent in the language of patience. He had waited for days in sniper hides, motionless, silent. He could wait for this. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The dog's shallow breathing was the only sound. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice a low, soothing murmur. Come on, buddy, let's go home. He stood up slowly and began to walk back toward his farm, not looking back. He took 10 paces, then 15. He heard a faint rustle behind him, the soft squelch of paws in mud. He stopped and glanced over his shoulder. The German shepherd was on its feet, swaying unsteadily. It took a hesitant step, then another, following him. It was a leap of faith, a tiny flicker of trust from an animal that had every reason to give up on the world. For the first time in years, Jake felt something other than rage or despair. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling. But it was there, a sense of purpose. He led the dog back to the farmhouse, the animal stumbling behind him like a shadow. Inside the dusty, cold kitchen, he laid out an old army blanket near the wood stove. The dog collapsed onto it, its legs giving way, and immediately fell into a deep, twitching sleep. Jake filled a bowl with water and placed it near the dog's head. Then he went to work. With a pair of bolt cutters from the barn, he carefully snipped off the heavy, filth-encrusted collar. It fell to the floor with a dull thud. As he gently cleaned the matted fur around the dog's neck, his fingers brushed against something. He parted the fur. There, tattooed on the inside of the dog's right ear, was a faint series of blue-black letters and numbers. K9-M778. USMC. Jake's blood ran cold. United States Marine Corps. This was no ordinary dog. This was a fellow veteran, a Marine. He gently examined the dog further, his touch now infinitely more careful. He felt a small, hard lump under the skin between its shoulder blades. A microchip. A sense of dread and urgency washed over him. This changed everything. This dog wasn't just abused. It was stolen or lost military property. He had to get it help. Real help. He looked up the number for the only veterinarian in the nearby town, a place he had avoided since he came home. His hand shook slightly as he dialed. Dr. Vance's office. How can I help you? A calm, professional voice answered. I have a dog, Jake stammered, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He's in bad shape. I need to bring him in. The vet clinic was sterile and bright, a world away from the grime and decay of Jake's farm. The air smelled of bleach and antiseptic, a clean, sharp scent that made Jake feel dirty and out of place. He had carried the dog in, the animal's 70-pound frame feeling like nothing in his arms. He laid him gently on the cold steel of the examination table. Dr. Eris Vance was a woman who radiated a quiet competence. She had kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor. She took one look at the emaciated shepherd and then at Jake, her expression hardening with suspicion. She saw a rough-looking man with haunted eyes and a dog that looked like it had been through a war. Her initial conclusion was obvious. Is this your dog? She asked, her tone carefully neutral but with an edge of accusation. No, I just found him, Jake said, his voice low. He knew how this looked. Iris didn't reply. She turned her attention to the dog, her hands moving with a gentle, practiced efficiency. She checked his heart, his breathing, the translucent pallor of his gums. He's severely dehydrated and malnourished, on the verge of organ failure. She looked back at Jake. Found him where? Next door. I bought him, Jake admitted, feeling a flush of shame. The owner was. He trailed off, unable to find the right word. Unfit. Eris's expression softened slightly. She had seen too much casual cruelty in her line of work. Okay, let's see what we're dealing with. She pulled a scanner from a drawer. Let's check for a chip. She ran the device over the dog's shoulders. It beeped loudly. Eris glanced at the screen, and her eyebrows shot up. She frowned, tapping at the display. What is it? Jake asked. It's encrypted, she said, looking puzzled. The chip is active, but the registration data is firewalled. All I can get is a designation. Asset 778, property of Department of Defense. And a warning. A warning. She turned the screen to him. In stark red letters, it read, Unauthorized possession is a federal offense. Do not interfere. Report to nearest military authority. Jake stared at the screen, the tattoo in the dog's ear suddenly making a terrifying amount of sense. This was a military working dog, an MWD, and he was in possession of it. He had moved from a simple rescue to grand theft of government property. Jake, you need to understand what this means, Eris said, her voice serious. This isn't a stray you saved. This is a piece of military hardware, as far as they're concerned. You can't just keep him. You have to report this. Report him to who? So they can put him in a kennel at some base until he dies of whatever trauma he's been through? Jake's voice was raw. Look at him. He's a veteran just like me. They threw him away. You don't know that, Eris countered gently. He could be listed as missing or stolen. His handler could be looking for him. Before Jake could respond, the bell over the clinic's front door chimed. 2 men walked in. They were not locals. They wore expensive, tactical-looking black jackets over civilian clothes. They moved with an unnerving synchronicity, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, professional assessment. They looked like the private security contractors Jake had seen overseas, the dangerous ones. One of them, a man with a shaved head and a scar that bisected his eyebrow, smiled a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. Dr. Vance, we're here about an asset that's gone missing. We tracked its transponder to this location. His gaze fell on the German shepherd lying on the table. The smile widened. Ah, there he is. The other man, taller and leaner, moved to block the door. It was a smooth, practiced motion, an envelopment. Who are you? Eris asked, stepping instinctively in front of the table, shielding the dog. We're from Daedalus Strategic, the scarred man said. We're here to retrieve our property. This dog is property of the Department of Defense, Eris stated, holding up the scanner. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. A technicality, Daedalus developed the K9 augmentation program under a DARPA contract. He's our prototype, proprietary hardware. Now, if you'll step aside, we'll take him and be on our way. This animal is in critical condition, Eris protested. He can't be moved. He's more resilient than he looks, the man said, his patience wearing thin. He took a step forward. Jake moved. He didn't think, he reacted. He put himself between the contractor and Eris, a solid, unmoving wall. You're not touching him, he said. The scarred man sized Jake up in an instant. He saw the limp, the worn clothes. He dismissed him. You've got 5 seconds to get out of the way, old man. That's when the dog, who had been barely conscious, lifted its head. A deep, guttural growl, full of a power that hadn't been there before, echoed from its chest. Its eyes were fixed on the scarred man. It recognized the threat. The contractor's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed. So the old programming is still in there somewhere. Good. He nodded to his partner. Bag him. The man by the door pulled a tranquilizer pistol from under his jacket. The world slowed down for Jake. He saw the movement, processed the threat, and his mind became a cold, clear calculator of violence. The clinic was a kill box. Table, counters, cabinets. Cover and concealment. 2 hostiles. one armed with a tranq gun, the other likely carrying concealed. He struck out like a viper. He grabbed a heavy stainless steel water bowl from the counter and flung it. It spun through the air like a discus, catching the man with the tranq gun square in the face. The man staggered back with a cry of pain, his nose erupting in a spray of blood. Simultaneously, Jake lunged forward, not at the scarred man, but to the side. He used his body to shove the heavy examination table on its wheels, sending it crashing into the scarred man's shins. The man roared in pain and surprise as he stumbled backward. "Contact!" the man yelled, reaching inside his own jacket. Jake didn't wait. He vaulted over a counter, his bad leg be damned, the adrenaline singing in his veins. He landed in a crouch, grabbing a tray of gleaming surgical instruments. Scalpels, forceps, clamps, improvised weapons. The man with the broken nose was recovering, raising the tranq pistol again. At that moment, the German Shepherd launched itself from the table. It was a blur of black and tan fury, a missile of teeth and muscle. It ignored its own pain and weakness, driven by a deep, programmed instinct to protect. It hit the man chest high, and they went down in a tangle of limbs and snarling. The scarred man had his own weapon out now, a compact pistol. He was trying to get a clear shot at Jake, who was using the cabinets as cover. "Damn it, get the dog," he screamed at his partner. Eris, who had been frozen in shock, reacted. She grabbed a large syringe, filled it with the first anesthetic she could reach, and jammed it into the scarred man's thigh as he moved past her. He yelled, a high, surprised sound, and slapped at his leg as if bitten by an insect. He turned on her, his face a mask of fury. That was the opening Jake needed. He exploded from behind the counter, a scalpel held in a reverse grip. He didn't aim to kill, he aimed to disable. A precise, lightning-fast slash across the man's forearm. The pistol clattered to the floor. Another quick movement, and Jake had the man in a chokehold, the point of the scalpel pressed against his carotid artery. "Drop it," Jake growled at the other man, who was struggling to fight off the snarling shepherd. "Or he dies." The man with the broken nose froze, his eyes wide with terror. The dog had his arm in its jaws, not breaking the skin, but holding with immense pressure. A warning. "Let him go," the scarred man choked out, the pressure on his throat cutting off his air. "We'll leave." "Get in your vehicle, both of you. Leave the weapons," Jake commanded, his voice the pure, cold tone of command authority. "Now." Slowly, cautiously, the other man disengaged from the dog, who backed away with a low growl, standing protectively near Jake. The man raised his hands, his face a mess of blood and fear. Jake shoved his hostage toward the door. "Go." The two men scrambled out of the clinic and into their black SUV. Tires squealed as they sped out of the parking lot and disappeared down the road. Silence descended on the clinic, broken only by the ragged sound of 3 heartbeats. Eris was pale, leaning against a counter. The dog stood panting, trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, a thin trickle of blood dripping from a reopened wound on its leg. Jake released the breath he'd been holding, the combat high draining away, leaving him shaky and cold. The scalpel fell from his numb fingers. The dog, Kaiser, let out a soft whine and limped toward Jake. It collapsed at his feet, laying its head on his boot. It had spent its last reserves of energy defending him. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice hoarse. "They'll be back, and they'll bring more friends." Eris nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Where can we go?" "My place," Jake said. "It's isolated, defensible." He looked down at the dog, a wave of fierce, protective loyalty washing over him. "I'm not letting them have him." They made it back to the farm as dusk bled across the sky, turning the clouds to bruised shades of purple and orange. Eris followed in her car, her headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The farmhouse looked even more like a haunted fortress in the twilight. Inside, Eris worked quickly to stitch the gash on Kaiser's leg and put him on an IV drip to combat the dehydration. The dog lay on the blanket by the stove, exhausted but alert, his eyes tracking Jake's every move. He had chosen his soldier. "They called him a prototype," Eris said, her hands busy cleaning her instruments. "Daedalus Strategic. I've heard of them. They're a high-end defense contractor, black budget stuff. They don't give up on their assets. I know, Jake said grimly. He was checking the sight lines from the windows, his mind falling back into the familiar rhythms of defensive preparation. He was back in the war, which is why I need to make a call. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years, a number he swore he would never use. Colonel Hayes, his old CO, the man who had delivered the news about his team, who had processed his medical discharge, who had looked at him with pity in his eyes. Jake had cut all ties, ashamed of being the one who lived. But now he had someone else to protect. He pressed the call button. It rang twice. Hayes, a gruff, familiar voice answered. Sir, it's Sergeant Thorne, Jake said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Thorne, my God, where are you? I'm in trouble, Colonel. Jake quickly and concisely explained the situation. The dog, the tattoo, the microchip, the contractors from Daedalus. He left out the part about the firefight in the vet clinic. Asset 778, Hayes said, his voice turning grim. Kaiser. We listed him as KIA. His handler, Sergeant Miller. He was with your team that day, Thorne. He was the MWD handler attached to your unit for that op. The floor dropped out from under Jake. Miller. Quiet, steady Miller, who always had a piece of jerky for his dog. He'd been a few yards behind Jake when the IED went off. Jake had seen him go down. He had assumed Kaiser had died with him. The dog on the floor, the last survivor of that day besides Jake himself, was a living, breathing piece of his own worst memory. The records show both Handler and K9 were killed in the blast, Hayes continued, his voice tight with anger. Daedalus must have recovered the dog's body, or what they thought was his body. They must have falsified the report. That's a federal crime, Thorne. They were trying to cover their tracks, retrieve their billion-dollar prototype before the Pentagon found out it survived. They found me, sir. They will be back, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of the revelation was crushing. This dog wasn't just a mirror of his pain. It was intrinsically linked to the source of it. Where are you, son? Hayes asked, his voice softening. Give me your coordinates. I'm spinning up a QRF. Hold your position. I'm coming. Jake gave him the address. Thank you, sir. Just hold on, Marine, Hayes said, and the line went dead. Jake slid down the wall, his good leg buckling. He put his head in his hands, the ghosts of Ramadi screaming in his ears. Miller, Garcia, Davies, and now Kaiser, the dog who had been there, who had seen it all, who had been left for dead just like Jake felt he had been. Kaiser whined softly and nudged his head under Jake's hand. Jake looked at the dog, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't shed in years. He wrapped his arms around the dog's neck and buried his face in its fur, a choked sob escaping his lips. It was a release of years of pent-up grief, guilt, and loneliness. The dog didn't pull away. It leaned into him, a warm, solid presence in the cold, dark room. A fellow survivor, an anchor. Eris watched them from across the room, her own eyes wet. She said nothing, simply bearing witness to the breaking and rebuilding of a man. An hour later, the sound of rotors thundered through the valley. 2 Black Hawk helicopters, sleek and menacing, descended on the field in front of the farmhouse. They landed without lights, their blades whipping up a storm of dead leaves and dirt. The ramps dropped, and a team of fully equipped Marines poured out, establishing a perimeter with swift, lethal efficiency. Colonel Hayes, now a general, was the first one to the porch. He was older, grayer, but his eyes held the same steel authority Jake remembered. He looked at Jake, then at the dog at his feet, then at the IV bag hanging from a nail on the wall. Looks like you've had a busy day, Sergeant, Hayes said, his expression unreadable. You could say that, sir, Jake replied, slowly getting to his feet. The Daedalus contractors have been intercepted, Hayes said, a grim satisfaction in his tone. They won't be bothering you again. Their contract is under review at the highest levels. You've uncovered something rotten, Thorne. Hayes knelt down and looked at Kaiser. The dog met his gaze without fear. Sergeant Miller was a good man. He loved this dog. He looked up at Jake. The official record will state that K9 Kaiser was recovered, treated for his injuries, and honorably retired from service due to wounds sustained in combat. His final disposition, Hayes paused, a faint smile touching his lips, is to be placed in the permanent care of a qualified veteran handler, someone who understands what he's been through. He stood up and put a hand on Jake's shoulder. He's your responsibility now, Marine. You saved his life. Let him save yours. 11 months later, the sun rose over a farm that was no longer a skeleton. It was healing. The farmhouse had a new roof and fresh white paint. The broken windows were replaced, gleaming in the morning light. The fields were cleared of weeds, and neat rows of green shoots pushed up from the dark, rich earth. The ghost of Jacob Thorne was gone. In his place was a man with calloused hands and a quiet peace in his eyes. Jake sat on the newly built porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. A magnificent German shepherd, his coat thick and glossy, his body a testament to strength and health, lay at his feet. Kaiser. He nudged Jake's hand with his nose, demanding a scratch behind the ears. Jake obliged, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Eris came out of the house, bringing him a plate of eggs. She had never left. Her small town practice was now a little busier, and she spent her evenings and weekends here, at the farm that had become a sanctuary. She leaned down and kissed Jake, a soft, easy gesture of belonging. General Hayes called, she said. The Daedalus executives were indicted. He said to tell you thank you. Jake nodded, looking out at the land. We're the ones who should be thanking him. He looked down at Kaiser, who was watching him with an expression of unwavering loyalty. They were two broken soldiers who had found their way home. They had faced the ghosts of their shared past and had chosen to live. The farm wasn't just a place of wood and nails anymore. It was a home, built on the foundation of a second chance. Jake had agreed to foster one dog for a weekend that had turned into a lifetime. He had rescued a dog from a chain, and in return the dog had unchained his soul. The war was finally over,